get us whip through this first early section and talk about animal fiction, which I really wanted to include in this course as well, because it's sort of a really important and separate for me strand in children's literature, in teen literature, and also really as a kind of a subgenre of fantasy. Lovely picture here of Jeremy Fisher on his lily pad in his lovely little footwear. Look at him, bless, exhibiting both human qualities. He's fishing, he's dressed, and yet also behaving somewhat as an animal, a sort of anthropomorphic blend. It's a form of fantasy and a natural lead into some of the other fantasy genres we've been looking at. It was very difficult to select books for this genre because there's so much you can draw on, and it's such a rich area to work with. Not only because children, teens, and adults can so strongly and empathically relate to animals and animal characters. We live with our pets, we humanize them, make them into give them human qualities and talk to them. We get unconditional love that we give and get from them, and so it's only natural to relate to characters as animals in stories. And you can see here one of the illustrations from Roald Dahl's fantastic Mr. Fox there, which Wes Anderson dramatized as a film. Changes were made for that film and a slightly different shift in focus from the book, but it's a wonderful wonderful adaptation and well worth visiting. So animal fantasy is a sort of just to sort of go by the book. What is it as a genre? It's a form of fantasy where the main characters are animals, and we look at them. We can sort of maybe characterize them a little by saying to what extent do the animals take on human characteristics. And the fantasy part is the fact that they do. Obviously, these characters are. So within this genre realm of animal fantasy, we can have animals that behave basically like their own species, but think and talk like humans, allowing us obviously to enter into their worlds, their minds and existence. I think Charlotte's Web is quite a good example of this from the course list on the 502 side, something you could easily deal with as well on the 102 side. The next step is not only thinking and talking, but also behaving like a human. And we saw there with Jeremy Fisher in Beatrix Potter that Fisher, I love the characters. I love the tale of Jeremy Fisher with Sir Isaac Newton and Ptolemy Tortoise. That he obviously acts like his own species, but he also acts like a human, begins to dress like a human, has a fishing rod, a basket. They have a roast grasshopper in butterfly sauce. And we can see this as well in things like the wind in the willows, not on the willows, predictive text there, where they, Molly and Ratty, have very strong animal characteristics, but also behave like humans to varying degrees. Paddington, a bear named Paddington, a favourite of mine from a very young age, and now reinvented in voiced by Ben Whishaw in Paddington, and there's been a sequel as well. Paddington, whose real name is pronounced Gore or something like that, does exhibit animal characteristics and species characteristics, but he's also been taught by humans, learnt their language, which takes on whole other tones, particularly in the new film versions. More of that later. And then we've got the complete anthropomorphization, very difficult word to say, anthropomorphization of animals, where they behave, speak, dresses, they do the whole kit and caboodle. and they become entirely humanized. You could argue that some of our stories, they are completely humanized, but normally we can see that there are varying degrees of this, and that's one way, one typology of looking at animal fantasy. Another way that we could think of is by distinguishing between an animal fantasy and some form of animal realism. And here's a simple definition. It's an imaginative story where the central character behaves in a manner true to the breed species. It's usually realistic. And that's why on our broader sort of span of reading lists here, from Paddington and Pooh all the way up to Tarka the Otter is there because it's a form of animal realism. The attempt really was made or chipped down, you could see maybe as to a degree as animal realism, though you could also argue that it's a form of fantasy too. But in Tarka the Otter, Tarka ends up basically shagging his grandmother, doesn't he? And it's not really weird. It's just that's what happens in an otter world. And so we've got a totally different. He doesn't take on human behaviors and concerns and niceties. You can see there as well. There's the hunt from Tarka the Otter, and you can see the hound Deadlock here in these wonderful illustrations. They're sort of Edwardian period illustrations from the beginning of the 20th century. So animal realism, though, it's pretty hard to do. For those of you who might have come across it, Jack London's sort of primitivistic animal stories attempt this. The Call of the Wild, White Fang, because you've really got to get inside the mind of an otter. It's not an easy thing to do, and to then make a drama out of it, which speaks to humans but is realistic at the same time, is also quite a difficult thing to do. Because the way we tell stories is based on being human very much. Well, let's have a look at some of the, just a little quick review of some of the things on the reading list. Again, we've had a project of extensive reading, and we've looked at genres, text types, conventions, rather than going into in-depth analysis at this stage, in trying to sort of give us a chance to get to know some more texts. And here, who's this character clutching a jar of marmalade? It's Paddington Bear. It's an animal fantasy where Paddington displays both bear and human behaviors all the way through. The bears are obviously taught by an anthropologist. Particularly, this is picked up on very heavily in the film version. You've got these sort of, and I'm going to start using some of these ideas as well. We've already talked about subject and theme, motifs, and I'm going to go through what motifs are in a minute once we've done this. But some of the motifs or symbols that you can pick up on in Paddington, one of them specifically is the jar of marmalade right there that runs through the entire story. Marmalade runs through it. Bit of a joke there. Ha ha. This idea of deepest, darkest Peru is quite an important motif, I'd say, in these books. And if you're going to get antsy fancy pantsy and artsy fartsy on this, you'd look at this and think about Paddington. Here's a tip to some of you fourth years, that it seems to have a lot to do with sort of colonization and empire, because Paddington's really taught by some 19th century anthropologist. The family are taught how to speak and a love of the British Empire and all things British. So he sort of Padders is kind of colonization in reverse. He's the other coming home to Britain, and of course, as is usual in dramas like this, or as typical of dramas like this, he ends up sort of embodying human virtues as a bear. Is a lovely illustration that's also on the 102 reading list, but could be used across the board. The Bildungsroman, or coming of age story, of Winnie the Pooh and Christopher Robin. As Christopher Robin was released last year. I think it's Jude Law, is it? I haven't seen that yet. Would really, really like to see that as a sort of postmodern retake on the Pooh story. Um, oh, those are not. Sorry, that's not the bits on the slide as well. Sorry, that's actually the wrong slide information. Going to hop over that for the minute and just concentrate. Do apologise. On Fantastic Mr. Fox, we'll come back to Winnie the Pooh later. We can talk about that in our books as well. We've got the motifs of poo sticks and various other things going on in Winnie the Pooh, which seems to deal with a young boy's imaginary world with his toys. Let's have a look at Fantastic Mr. Fox, and we've got the original book cover there. I love this. You can see how you've got the later Quentin Blake sort of very sort of scratchy illustrations, but you can see how Wes Anderson has picked from these original illustrations from Donald Chafin here. It's an animal fantasy. You can see right there, Fantastic Mr. Fox there with his human clothes. We've got motifs that run through this, particularly the tree itself and sort of the animal's home there, the roots of the tree in the earth. And these sort of motifs in it point to the themes, what it might actually mean. And there certainly seems to be a sort of an element of conservationism in this story. Roald Dahl stories very often do, like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, with capitalism and greed, often deal with quite strong thematic material. And the themes here could be expressed as that we all belong to an ecosphere, and animals are an important part of that. So by threatening them, we're threatening our own ecosphere and biodiversity. And if there is a sort of message, if you will, to Fantastic Mr. Fox, it does seem to be something about the relationship of humans to the natural world. That's very strong through this book, and the Wes Anderson film version is excellent and well worth picking up on. Charlotte's Web, another animal fantasy that at times borders on a degree of animal realism, but what we do get out of this sort of type 1 animal fantasy is the sort of thought and communication of the animals, if they don't actually really take on any human behaviors per se. Yes, Quentin Blake, who's excellent, has come to dominate, obviously, the Roald Dahl scene, but it's worth remembering that a lot of the books have other traditional illustrations before Quentin Blake. And I love that one of that cover as well, the Donald Chafin illustrations, which is what Wes Anderson has pulled upon. Love Wes Anderson, definitely. Various motifs that we can think of from Charlotte's Web. There it is. There's the web, of course. The web that could be Darwin's tangled web, the web of life, the webs we weave. And obviously there's the sort of the human writing in the web, this attempt to communicate. I think it's terrific, is it? Some pig, the words that Charlotte weaves. Similarly, Fern's dolls perhaps are a motif that run through this book as well. And from, say, for example, the symbolism of the web, the eating of the flies in the web, this idea of life and death all being part of sort of one cycle, would be sort of a strong theme of this book, that change is kind of inevitable and irreversible. And that's part of the lyrical beauty of E.B. White's book. It is a wonderfully written lyrical read, full of this sense of the inevitability of the life cycle. You can think of Charlotte's babies and them all being blown away. And of course, similarly, not only life and death and change, but Fern's inevitable loss of innocence, putting away of her dolls, which seem to symbolize this as a part of her growing up. It's very bittersweet indeed, very, very poignant and beautiful, and very thematically strong. And those themes we can identify in the motifs that really communicate them to us. Hope you can see where I'm going with this. I have picked out, Ingan, actually quite a few some covers as well that I remember from other illustrated versions of books from way back now in the 70s and 80s, or even from the 60s as well. The Wind in the Willows is another tremendously poignant animal fantasy that gives a very strong sense of place and time, the Thames River Basin and the Edwardian pre-World War One period, really, before the horrors of the World War One and the modernist period. Um, uh, they wear human clothes. They still have animal behaviours, but as you can see here, Toad resides in Toad Hall and dreams of new methods of transportation. Of course, the motor car being one of them. And these are the motifs that are very strong in the Wind in the Willows that can unlock the themes. The Wild Wood seems to be a different form of nature. Perhaps the untamed seems to represent the untamed nature. Um, the river life seems to be a sort of idyllic um, picture of organized nature and a sort of perfect pastoral nature. And then the river, of course, the lazy river, the slow river, where they enjoy life as opposed to the fast, blustery modernity of the motor car, which brings Toad into constant problems. And so we've got these sort of themes of untamed nature contra this sort of idyllic view of sort of river life as being some sort of perfect, um, both in terms of time, but also place and time. It's sort of, a pace of life as well, contra modern technology. In The Wind in the Willows, that's very strong thematically as well, and a wonderful story and beautiful book. Tarka the Otter. Sorry, it's not animal fantasy. I do apologise. I finished off these a bit too quick last night after other work. It should say animal realism. Tarka's an animal. There's no interspecies communication. There's a minimal anthropomorphism. So this is animal realism. I'll update that and re-upload it. There are motifs like the hound Deadlock, whose name seems to come from Charles Dickens' Bleak House, Lindy, Lady Dedlock, Lord and Lady Dedlock, which is quite interesting. The hunt itself, which we saw that very vivid scene of earlier, the river as well. They seem to symbolize these motifs and give us various themes in the book. It seems to imply, Graham seems to imply that nature is beautiful and cruel, or at best dispassionate, and that in this, that sort of nature seems to be a sort of Darwinian battle for survival, and behind that, you might then uncover how much of a piece of its time it is. This is from between the wars, 20s and 30s, England. And sadly, Graham was strongly sympathetic to fascist movements in England and had very strong anti-Semitic sympathies, as did most of England in the 1920s and 30s. So thematically, there's lots of strong subtexts going on here as well, and can see that this sort of depiction of life as beautiful and cruel and a game of survival of the fittest seems to support supremacist and fascist thinking, or at least reflect them in the time. I'm not looking for that necessarily. That's maybe sort of överkurs, as we say in Swedish. But I'm just looking at how you can look at motifs and how they will give you themes. Going to be done in about 5 minutes and go on to our first exercise. So sit tight. Expressing themes is really the end point in literature, and we've looked at character and setting, and I'm going to touch on conflict. We've looked at story, plot, perspective, who's telling the story, different sort of techniques there. I'm going to look more at narrative writing as well in part 2 today. But really, the most important thing about a book is what it's about, isn't it? And a subject is what it's about. A theme is what it says about its subject. So subject is just literally what happens or what it is. Theme is what its meaning. And the third term that is very important here that you've seen me using again is motif. And motif is a recurring element that has symbolic significance. Motifs are thematic and state or restate a theme. So by looking for these motifs, it might help us explore theme and separate that from subject. So how many examples? Let's have a look at a few examples of just a potential motif, theme, subject division. And then I'm going to ask you to go into some groups which I've set up and explore it yourselves a little bit, because I think it's quite important that we can think about the kind of texts and genres we've been looking at and understand how we can get meaning out of them. So I'm just going to pick out randomly from different genre groups here. I'm going to start off with Hunger Games because it's in my mind, because I've been doing To Kill a Mockingbird with the 4th years. And there's a songbird motif as well in the Hunger Games. If anything, it's the mockingjay that is running through the Hunger Games. Mockingjay is a portmanteau of mockingbird and blue jays, which comes from To Kill a Mockingbird. And the blue jays are the rabble rousers, the bullies on the on the quarter who take charge, and the mockingbirds are the songbirds who are fragile and can be easily killed, but you should never. It's a sin to kill a mockingbird. Atticus Finch, also named after a songbird, says in To Kill a Mockingbird. And so the motif of the mockingjay, particularly if we understand where it's come from, kind of puts together the fighters and the songbirds into one person and says the songbird must become the bully, the fighter. It must stand up to it. So the theme here is, that sometimes you're going to have to stand up for what you believe in. Sometimes you're going to have to fight in order to survive. And by making that stand, you might inspire other people to do the right thing. And so that's maybe that's a bit clumsy. That's me sort of trying to summarize kind of what the theme that comes out of that motif. There are other ways of also seeing the mockingbird as well, because the mockingbird stands a little bit for innocence. But here as well, this idea of the bully and the songbird in one portmanteau, in one body, is really the theme, the meaning. And the subject is really just what happens, isn't it? A young girl tries to survive in a deadly game and becomes a symbol for resistance. Okay, so that's literal. The theme, in a sense, is representational, figurative, and often it's embodied by a single motif. Here, the mockingjay that we'd all recognise from the Hunger Games. So that's a moment, motif, theme, subject. Let's have a look at the very popular, I think, excellent, absolutely true Diary of a Part-Time Indian. Absolutely recommend having a look at this book at any point. I know we haven't done it. Lots of classes do this as a single book, but I've put it on a list for choice. One of the motifs in the drawings and in the book is the Indian reservation in the Absolutely True Diary. And it keeps on recurring, this idea that they're sort of on the reservation. What does reservation mean? It's a funny word as well. What are they? They're reserving something, which could have both a positive and a negative meaning. And that sort of duality comes forth as a theme in the book, really, that self-presentation can also be, a form of isolation. So maybe it's not necessarily a good thing that you can retreat into a reserve and that it might destroy you, as it seems to be doing to the communities in the book. And so you can also tease out of that motif of the res, that Arnold learns that, and Rowdy, his best friend, his foil, sort of expresses it very well, that he has to leave the reservation in order to preserve their indigenous way of life. I think it's Rowdy that points out that they're migratory, they're nomads. So the reservation guarantees their way of life, but it also changes it. And the subject is really quite simply what we're seeing in it, which is life on the reservation and a young boy's dilemma. This is a dilemma, isn't it? Really, for Arnold's Spirit, or Junior. So there we can see the sort of the subject. It's a dilemma about whether to stay on the reservation or leave. It's about life on the reservation. Thematically, it's about what that life on the reservation means, and in terms of motif, it's kind of symbolized through the res, this sort of idea. Let's have a look at one other, because that's from sort of Bildungsroman, or coming of age stories, or fictional diaries. I kind of collapsed genres into each other there. Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. It's just to quickly pick up on the golden ticket, which seems to be a strong motif. I could have chosen chocolate as well, obviously, here as well. The golden ticket seems to be a way of getting ahead in life. It's a lottery, isn't it? And lotteries seem to be a part of sort of late 20th century capitalism, 21st century capitalism. What the golden ticket seems to say is that sort of modern life and the sort of the dream of prosperity that capitalism offers us tends to sort of make us lose sight of what we have right in front of us, which seems to be one of the strong sort of themes of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, that we dream about something else when everything that we want is actually right in front of us. In other words, Charlie already has his golden ticket. He's got his family, and he's got himself, and he's got his integrity. And that's sort of the meaning that you can get that seems to be attached to that golden ticket. I think I was discussing with the groups about chocolate and greed and sort of various other ways of interpreting that, which is absolutely open and true. And in terms of subject, well, the subject is Willy Wonka's competition in Dahl's liminal fantasy. Just to give us a sort of category, liminal fantasy is when the fantastic intrudes on the real world. So we've got various sort of forms of motif, theme, and subject here. I've also looked at Paddington, Marmalade. The world is interconnected, and what we do at home affects the furthest flung, deepest, darkest corners of the world. Whereas the subject is a talking bear from Peru, seems aware of British culture and comes to Britain. The Wind in the Willows, Toad's crazes and obsessions, the motor car, for example, as a motif. Thematically, Toad's obsession with anything new and modern makes him sort of like a figure of ridicule, really. And Graham seems to be sort of mocking modernity, whilst sort of setting up this sort of idyll, eulogizing the sort of stillness and slowness of life by the river. Across Nouveau Riche, Toad loves new fads and modes of transports. That's the simple, literal subject. And Charlotte's Web. Well, the web, life and death coexist. And the characters, Wilbur Templeton, learn that death is part of life and essential to its continuance. Whereas the subject is a spider and a pig becomes friends on a farm. That's presumably where the Simpsons and Homer Simpson got the fantastic Spider Pig ruse. Spider Pig, Spider Pig. Okay. So lots of ideas there. I'm going to ask you to think about motifs, like here as well, how they can be ideas or words, like choices as a motif in The Sleeper of the Spindle, which seem to point to the theme that it's free will, it's our own choices that makes us humans and individuals in The Sleeper and the Spindle. that characters can be motifs, like Sonny Baudelaire in a series of unfortunate events, The Bad Beginning. The theme seems to be rather like Gandalf in The Lord of the Rings. Even the smallest person can change the course of the future. That we can all have a role to play. We all have individual skill sets that can contribute to groups and society. Whereas the subject is a girl who bites things. Motif can also be a sort of an object or part of the setting, like dust in Northern Lights, which seems to like symbolize the divine spark or consciousness, because as you can see on the picture on the right, angels are made up of dust. And there are various themes you can draw out of that as well. Without consciousness, humans would be brutish automatons. That's actually from the text. They're just basically animal machines. And also that our imagination and childlike sense of wonder are what keep us connected to the universe. Whereas really, as a subject, Northern Lights is about a girl who goes on a journey to find her missing friend. But that journey has a symbolic, figurative meaning as well. We're not going to do any readings today. There's the Paddington film. What I'm going to do is I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to go to the task. And we're going to do a shorter task to begin with. I know you've been very patient this morning with your questions and a long period there, just going through some stuff. What I'm going to do is I'm going to look at task 1 for today and ask you to go into the existing groups that are there. The link should have been mended, I'm hoping, to our overview. All our tasks, still going through tasks, giving feedback constantly. So do not worry, it's beginning to fill up the task board as well. So what I'd like you to do for task 1 today, and this is it's going to take us up to near lunch, I think. What we'll do is we'll do maybe half an hour just thinking about this in groups. The first task 1 is motifs and themes. So following on the examples that I've already given you, I'd like you to discuss your animal fiction texts. Failing that, you can also draw on Bildungsroman and diaries that we've just done, or science fiction in 502. And I'd like you to look at this idea of motif, theme, and subject, and whether we can separate them, identify them, and maybe begin to think about, okay, what are the motifs in this book? What themes do they express, and how is that different from the subject? And that allows us to really get to grips with a whole text perspective. So really, we're identifying the difference between subject and theme here. And obviously, the reason why I've chosen to do this here is that none of these books are really about animals, are they? The subject is always an animal does this, or a talking animal has an adventure. That's always the subject. The themes really say something generally about human character, existence, and worlds. That's what's quite important here as well. So what I'd like you to do is to set up in your groups and just explore this idea. You can start off with animal fiction. You're very welcome to draw on any genre texts as well from the group, from the course. And what I will do is I can see you going in and making your tasks. I'm going to go into people, and I've set up groups to today for our final practice this afternoon. But you can start off in those texts, in those groups. Sorry. And so here we are, 9 and 10. I've called this afternoon genre games because we're actually going to go between genres. This is the 502. You're already put into 4 groups. Group 1 is called Bildungsroman. Group 2 is called Fairy Tale and Gothic. This doesn't mean you have to be following these genres. This is for later. Group 3 is called Fantasy. And Group 4 is called Science Fiction. So you already have groups to go into there. And the same goes for, I should have stopped the recording. This task is based on animal stories as in the task description. If you are struggling with animal stories, you can consider others, but you should start with animal stories and what you've been reading. So this is your sort of your warm-up task with that. These are the groups that I've just organized for the entire session where we're going to play genre games in the afternoon. For 102s, there are animal stories, coming of age, fairy tale, and picture books, but you're already separated into groups, and those will be the start groups this afternoon as well, and then we'll rotate through stations. So find yourself in your genre group. You will be doing tasks based on animal fiction, and you're reading for animal fiction primarily. That's your number one. So hopefully in your group, you'll have people who've looked at, representing readers of all three texts in your section. So let me stop the recording.